This video discusses a tragic case as a way to raise awareness about child safety and investigation challenges. Nothing here should be taken as an accusation against any individual.
The legendary investigator Lou Smith. He had a history of closing cases.
He had such tenacity. He was a bulldog. Once he got something in his mind, once he got the reins in his teeth, he was not letting go.
The Smith theory suggested that an intruder had been observing the Ramsey family, possibly for weeks, learning their routines and planning an incident. The note found at the scene might have been prepared in advance, with specific details about JonBenét Ramsey's bonus obtained through surveillance or overheard conversations. But how could an outsider gain such intimate knowledge without raising suspicion? Smith believed the individual entered through the basement window, which showed evidence of disturbance consistent with someone climbing through from the outside. In Smith's view, the state of the window wasn't staged, but was genuine evidence of how the responsible party gained entry to the house. According to this theory, the intruder went upstairs to JonBenét Ramsey's bedroom, where the incident may have involved forceful actions to gain control before carrying her to the basement. The original plan may have been an abduction. But, as is so often the case in complex events, something appears to have gone wrong. JonBenét may have awakened, forcing the intruder to inflict a major injury. When the injury proved critical, forensic findings were interpreted as restriction involving an improvised mechanism described in the case file. The individual then fled, leaving the note behind. Smith's theory accounted for the evidence suggesting an abduction, the sensitive findings debated among experts, and the responsible party's apparent familiarity with the house layout. An intruder who had been surveilling the family would know about the basement areas where JonBenét could be taken without immediate discovery. Most importantly, this theory was supported by DNA from an unidentified source found on JonBenét's clothing, which couldn't have come from any family member. This finding suggested that someone outside the family had been in contact with her around the time of the critical incident. The conflict between investigators Thomas and Smith wasn't just about interpreting evidence. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to criminal investigation. Thomas focused on statistical probabilities and behavioral analysis, noting that in the vast majority of these types of cases involving children, family members are responsible, and that the Ramseys' behavior after the event was, to him, unusual. In contrast, Smith focused on physical evidence and crime scene reconstruction, arguing that the evidence pointed toward an outside attacker, regardless of statistical expectations. When two veteran investigators look at the exact same evidence and see two entirely different stories, where does the truth lie? Their disagreement became increasingly bitter as the investigation continued. Thomas felt that Smith was being influenced by the Ramsey family's legal team and was ignoring clear indicators of family involvement. Smith felt that Thomas had developed tunnel vision focused on the parents and was missing crucial evidence that could lead to the individual responsible. The conflict came to a head during the grand jury investigation, where both detectives testified extensively, presenting competing theories based on the same set of facts. Jurors heard Thomas argue that Patsy Ramsey was responsible for the outcome, while Smith argued just as passionately that an unknown intruder was behind the crime. When the district attorney announced that no charges would be filed, both Thomas and Smith felt vindicated and betrayed simultaneously. How could a single decision produce such contradictory reactions? Thomas believed his theory had been proven correct, but that outside considerations had prevented prosecution. Smith believed his intruder theory had been validated, but that the focus on the family had prevented a proper search for the responsible party. Frustrated with the investigation's direction, Thomas resigned from the Boulder Police Department in August 2000. He later wrote a book detailing his theory and his criticisms of how the case was handled. Smith also stepped away from the official investigation, feeling his intruder theory was being ignored. He continued working on the case independently until 2010, never wavering in his belief that an outsider was responsible for what happened to JonBenét. The Thomas-Smith conflict illustrates why the case has remained unresolved for so long. Two experienced investigators working with the same evidence reached completely opposite conclusions. Their disagreement wasn't about minor details but about the fundamental question of whether this was a family crime or an intruder incident. This division influenced other investigators, and the Boulder Police Department became fractured into camps pursuing different theories. The media coverage of this internal conflict further complicated matters, creating public confusion and undermining confidence in the investigation's credibility. Perhaps most damaging, the intense focus on these two competing explanations may have prevented investigators from considering alternative theories. Did this polarization inadvertently close off other avenues that might have led to the truth? Today, nearly 3 decades after the tragic event involving JonBenét Ramsey, investigators are still dealing with the legacy of this conflict. Some continue to believe that family members were responsible, while others remain convinced that an outside attacker was behind what happened to JonBenét. The evidence that created this divide hasn't changed, but could new technologies and investigation techniques finally provide the answers that have eluded investigators for so long? DNA evidence would eventually become the primary focus of the investigation, potentially resolving the Thomas Smith conflict by providing scientific proof of who was present at the time of the critical incident. But even this evidence has proven more complicated and controversial than anyone expected, creating new questions about how to interpret physical evidence in complex criminal cases. In 2008, 12 years after the incident, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey made an announcement that shocked everyone who had been following the case. Based on new DNA testing technology, she was officially clearing JonBenét Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and Burke Ramsey of any involvement. The DNA from an unidentified source found at the crime scene, Lacey declared, belonged to the individual responsible for what happened to JonBenét. This announcement should have ended decades of suspicion against the Ramsey family, but instead it created new controversies about how DNA evidence should be interpreted. In a case so defined by public division, could a scientific declaration truly put an end to years of suspicion? The DNA story in the JonBenét case begins with the initial processing of the scene in 1996. When investigators conducted the forensic examination, they found DNA from an unidentified source that couldn't be matched to anyone in her family. This genetic material was detected in multiple locations on her clothing, with some samples revealing complex forensic anomalies. In 1996, DNA technology was still relatively primitive, and the genetic profile recovered was partial and degraded. But even with these limitations, investigators could definitively say that this DNA didn't come from a member of the Ramsey family. The presence of this unidentified DNA should have been a major breakthrough. It seemed to offer scientific proof that someone outside the family was responsible for the outcome, but the evidence also raised troubling questions. The first was how this DNA got onto JonBenét's clothing. But what if the very nature of that DNA was more ambiguous than anyone first realized? The genetic material was not of a type that would provide clear evidence of a certain kind of contact. Instead, it appeared to be what forensic experts call touch DNA, genetic material transferred through skin contact. Touch DNA can be transferred in numerous ways that have nothing to do with a violent crime. It could be left by someone who handled the clothing during manufacturing, packaging, or retail sale. It could also be transferred by someone who did her laundry, helped her dress, or had innocent physical contact with her. Investigators tried to account for these innocent explanations by tracing the clothing back to its source, but these efforts didn't provide clear answers. The situation was complicated by the fact that one of the garments JonBenét was wearing at the time of the discovery was several sizes too large for her and came from a package intended as a gift. How can investigators trace the origins of a piece of evidence when its own history is a puzzle? The fact that DNA from an unidentified source was found on multiple pieces of clothing suggested it might be significant. If the genetic material had come from innocent handling, it would likely be found on only one item. The presence of the same profile on different garments suggested direct contact with JonBenét herself. But even this interpretation had problems. The DNA found wasn't identical in all cases. Some genetic markers matched across samples, but others didn't. This suggested either the DNA was degraded or that material from multiple people had been found. As DNA technology improved, investigators were able to get better profiles from the genetic material. More sophisticated testing provided a more complete picture of the unidentified source's DNA signature. But better technology also revealed how complex and potentially misleading genetic evidence could be. The improved analysis showed that the genetic material was indeed from a single unidentified male, strengthening the argument that the DNA was significant to the case rather than innocent contamination. The testing revealed how little genetic material was actually present and how easily it could have been transferred through innocent contact. In 2003, the DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. The search came back negative, meaning that whoever left the genetic material at the scene had never been entered into the system for a prior offense. This result was both disappointing and encouraging for investigators. It didn't immediately identify a suspect, but it did suggest that what happened to JonBenét Ramsey was not caused by someone with an extensive documented criminal history. But what does it truly mean when the nation's most advanced criminal database comes up empty? The DNA evidence became increasingly important as other aspects of the investigation stalled. The initial response had complicated later forensic review of the physical evidence. Witness testimony was limited because the incident occurred inside the Ramsey house while family members were asleep. The note found at the scene provided clues about the mindset of the responsible party but didn't definitively identify who wrote it. In this environment, genetic evidence seemed to offer the possibility of scientific certainty in a case dominated by speculation. If investigators could match the DNA, they would have definitive proof of a person's presence at the scene. This approach led to the DNA testing of numerous people connected to the case. JonBenét Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and Burke Ramsey were tested and eliminated as sources of the unidentified genetic material. Other individuals of interest were also tested and eliminated when their DNA didn't match the profile from the scene. Each exclusion was treated as definitive proof that the tested individual was not the person responsible for what happened to JonBenét. This process seems objective, but it was based on a critical assumption that the unidentified DNA definitely came from the responsible party. This raises a crucial question: what if that foundational assumption is flawed? The most pivotal DNA-based decision came in 2008 when District Attorney Mary Lacy used advanced techniques to re-examine the genetic material. The results strengthened the unidentified male DNA profile. Based on this enhanced profile, Lacy concluded that the genetic material definitely came from the individual behind the crime and that anyone whose DNA didn't match this profile was not involved in the critical incident. She officially cleared the Ramsey family and apologized for the years of suspicion they had endured. Was this the definitive end of one chapter, or the beginning of a new debate over the certainty of science? Lacy's announcement was based on solid scientific analysis, but it reflected her specific interpretation of the evidence. She was convinced the genetic material had to have come from the responsible party because of the pattern in which it was found on JonBenét's clothing. However, other investigators weren't so sure. They pointed out that touch DNA could be transferred in numerous innocent ways and that eliminating persons of interest based solely on this comparison might be allowing the responsible party to escape detection. The debate over DNA interpretation reflected broader questions about its use in investigations. DNA is incredibly powerful when it definitively links a suspect to a scene, but it can be misleading when used to eliminate individuals who might be connected through other evidence. Some investigators felt the focus on DNA had distracted from other important evidence. The note still pointed towards someone with intimate knowledge of the family. The scene still suggested someone comfortable moving around inside the house. The timing and method of the incident still fit patterns more consistent with family knowledge than a random intruder. Had the investigation become so focused on a single powerful piece of evidence that it risked overlooking the broader context of the case? The DNA controversy reached a new level in 2016 when advances in genetic genealogy opened up new possibilities for identifying the source of unknown DNA. Instead of just searching criminal databases for direct matches, investigators could now use DNA to build family trees and identify potential persons of interest through their relatives. This technique had been used successfully in other cold cases, most famously in the Golden State Killer case, where genetic genealogy identified a suspect whose DNA hadn't been in any criminal database. The technique offered new hope for solving the JonBenét Ramsey case by potentially identifying the unknown male whose genetic material had been found at the crime scene. But genetic genealogy also revealed new complications in DNA interpretation. The technique works best with high-quality DNA samples that contain substantial genetic material. The degraded touch DNA found in the JonBenét case might not be sufficient for reliable genealogy analysis, and attempts to build family trees from limited genetic material could produce false leads. How does an investigation proceed when its most promising tool carries such a high risk of error? The current status of DNA evidence in the JonBenét case reflects both the promise and the limitations of genetic analysis in criminal investigations. The unknown male DNA remains the most scientifically objective evidence in the case, but its interpretation continues to be controversial among investigators and experts. This leads to the central question that has defined the modern phase of this case. If the DNA definitely came from the individual responsible for JonBenét's death, then the case should be solvable through genetic genealogy. But if the DNA came from innocent contact unrelated to the incident, then has its prominence in the investigation actually prevented the case from being solved by directing attention away from other evidence and suspects? The current investigation is betting heavily on genetic genealogy as the key to finally solving this case. But success will depend not just on the technology working properly, but on the fundamental assumption that the DNA evidence points toward the actual person responsible. The DNA evidence has transformed the JonBenét case from a traditional investigation into a waiting game for a scientific breakthrough. But after nearly 30 years, investigators are still waiting for that breakthrough to provide the answers that have eluded them since 1996. 29 years after JonBenét Ramsey's life was cut short in her Boulder home, her father, John Ramsey, continues to fight for answers with the determination of someone who knows time is running out. At 81 years old, he has become the driving force behind renewed efforts to solve his daughter's case, pushing investigators to use cutting-edge DNA technology that didn't exist when she was taken. The latest chapter in this decades-long mystery centers on genetic genealogy, the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer and solved dozens of other cold cases. But will success in the JonBenét case require more than just advanced technology? Will it require the unknown DNA found at the scene to definitively belong to the person responsible? Genetic genealogy works by comparing crime scene DNA to genetic material voluntarily submitted to consumer ancestry services. When investigators find relatives of the unknown person whose DNA was collected, they can build family trees and identify potential individuals through genealogical research. This technique revolutionized cold case investigations starting around 2018. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated how genetic genealogy could identify suspects who had never been arrested and whose DNA wasn't in any criminal database. Within a few years, hundreds of cold cases were being solved using similar techniques. The JonBenét case seemed like a perfect candidate for this approach. Investigators had a DNA profile from an unknown male whose genetic material was found on the victim's clothing. Traditional database searches had failed to identify this person, but genetic genealogy might succeed where other techniques had failed. However, the method requires high-quality DNA samples with sufficient genetic material to build reliable family trees. The touch DNA found in the JonBenét case was degraded and limited, raising questions about whether it would be adequate for analysis. Attempts to use poor-quality DNA for family tree construction could produce false leads and waste precious investigative resources. John Ramsey became a vocal advocate for using genetic genealogy in his daughter's case. Having been cleared by DNA evidence in 2008, he had nothing to fear from genetic testing and everything to gain from identifying the unknown male. Ramsey held press conferences, gave interviews, and lobbied law enforcement agencies to pursue the analysis. In 2022, the Boulder Police Department announced a partnership with the Colorado Cold Case Review Team to examine the case using modern investigative techniques, including genetic genealogy. This partnership represented the first systematic review of the case in years and offered new hope. The Colorado Cold Case Review Team brought fresh perspectives and advanced technology to a case that had been worked by dozens of investigators over nearly 3 decades. Team members weren't personally invested in earlier theories, allowing them to examine all evidence objectively. But even this new approach hinges on one fundamental question. If the unknown DNA came from the person who caused JonBenét's death, then genetic genealogy might finally solve the case. But what if the DNA came from innocent contact unrelated to the events of that night? In that scenario, genetic genealogy would identify someone who had nothing to do with the crime, while the person responsible remained unknown. These concerns are not just theoretical. Other cases have shown how this powerful technique can produce false leads when DNA evidence is misinterpreted. In one notable Texas case, genetic genealogy identified a suspect who was charged with a serious offense, only to have the charges dropped when further investigation proved the individual was innocent and the DNA had been deposited through incidental contact. The JonBenét Ramsey case presents additional challenges beyond the quality of the DNA sample. The high-profile nature of the case means that any genealogy analysis will receive intense media scrutiny and public attention. Could an incorrect identification based on a complex scientific process irreparably harm an innocent person's life while failing to solve the actual case? There was also the question of who should conduct the analysis: law enforcement agencies or private companies specializing in genealogical research. Different approaches might produce different results, and the choice of methodology could influence whether the technique succeeds or fails. John Ramsey advocated for using private genealogy experts who had experience with difficult cases and degraded DNA samples. He argued that these specialists might be more likely to succeed than agencies still learning how to use the technology effectively. However, private analysis raises questions about the chain of custody and evidence handling that might complicate any future prosecution. The current genetic genealogy efforts represent a significant investment of time and resources in a case that has already consumed millions of dollars and thousands of investigative hours. Success would vindicate this investment and potentially solve one of America's most famous unsolved cases. Failure, on the other hand, might finally close the book on a case that has resisted a solution for decades. This approach also represents a philosophical shift in how the case is being viewed. Instead of trying to solve it through traditional techniques like witness interviews and crime scene analysis, investigators are betting that science alone can provide the answer. Has modern investigation reached a point where traditional detective work takes a back seat to waiting for scientific breakthroughs? In the JonBenét case, this approach makes sense given the limitations of other evidence. The crime scene was compromised from the beginning. Witness testimony is limited because the events occurred inside the family home. The ransom note provides clues about the writer's mindset, but hasn't definitively identified its author despite decades of analysis. The DNA evidence, therefore, offers the possibility of objective, scientific identification. If genetic genealogy succeeds, it will provide a form of proof that is difficult to dispute. The unknown male whose genetic material was found at the scene would be identified, investigated, and potentially brought to justice. But this approach also carries significant risks. If genetic genealogy fails because the DNA sample is too degraded, the case may finally be considered unsolvable. If it succeeds in creating a profile but identifies someone who had innocent contact with JonBenét, valuable time will be wasted. The analysis is currently ongoing, with results anticipated in the next year or two. The process is complicated, requiring careful analysis of genetic markers and the construction of complex family trees. Success will depend not just on the technology, but on the fundamental assumption that the DNA belongs to the person responsible. If it doesn't, investigators may finally have to accept that this case cannot be solved by DNA analysis alone. John Ramsey continues to push for answers, knowing that at his age, this may be his last chance to see his daughter's case resolved. His advocacy has kept the case in the public eye and maintained pressure on law enforcement to continue investigating. The current efforts represent either the final chapter or the beginning of a new phase. If the technique succeeds, it will be a landmark moment. If it fails, investigators may have to consider that the answer lies elsewhere, in evidence that has been overlooked or theories that have been dismissed. This forces us to confront a difficult question. If this final high-tech effort leads nowhere, does it mean the case is truly unsolvable? Or could it mean the answer has been there all along, buried in the original files, waiting for a new perspective free from the weight of the past? What do you think is more likely to bring justice for JonBenét? A microscopic clue found in a lab, or a human detail that has been hidden in plain sight for nearly 30 years? Regardless of whether genetic genealogy solves the case, its use represents the evolution of criminal investigation over the 3 decades since JonBenét's passing. The techniques available to investigators today would have seemed like science fiction in 1996, offering hope that even the most difficult cases can eventually be solved with patience, technology, and determination. And yet, the question remains, will science finally provide the answers that traditional investigation couldn't deliver, or are some mysteries destined to remain unsolved despite our best efforts? Nearly 30 years have passed since the loss of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey in her family's Boulder home, and the questions that emerged on December 26, 1996, remain as haunting today as they were then. Who wrote that bizarre ransom note demanding exactly $118,000? Who knew enough about the Ramsey family to reference John's background and his Christmas bonus? And who felt comfortable enough to spend hours inside their house, crafting an elaborate deception while a terrible discovery waited to be made in the basement? After examining all the evidence and all the conflicts, the truth still waits to be discovered. The investigation revealed far more than anyone expected about American society, family dynamics, and the criminal justice system. The case became a mirror that reflected our discomfort with child beauty pageants, our fascination with wealth, our assumptions about how grieving parents should behave, and our faith that science can solve any mystery. But it also revealed the limitations of a criminal investigation when evidence is compromised and investigators pursue competing theories. The initial handling of the crime scene has become a textbook example of how not to manage a homicide investigation, and the media coverage demonstrated how public fascination can both help and hinder the search for truth. Most fundamentally, the JonBenét case shows how difficult it can be to determine what happened when evidence points in multiple directions. How can reasonable people reach completely different conclusions based on the same set of facts? Detective Steve Thomas was convinced that Patsy Ramsey was involved in her daughter's death and staged an elaborate cover-up. In contrast, Detective Lou Smith was equally convinced that an intruder was responsible during a kidnapping attempt that went wrong. Both theories explained some aspects of the evidence while struggling to account for others. Thomas's theory explained the intimate knowledge in the ransom note, but couldn't fully account for the unknown DNA. Smith's theory explained the DNA, but struggled with the note's personal references and the lack of evidence of a forced entry. The grand jury that spent over a year examining the evidence reached its own controversial conclusion, voting to indict John and Patsy Ramsey not for the primary act, but for child abuse resulting in death and for being an accessory to a crime. These unusual charges suggested the jurors believed the parents bore some responsibility without necessarily believing they committed the final act. However, District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictments, arguing the evidence wouldn't support a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. His decision kept the grand jury's findings secret for over a decade. The focus on DNA that began in the early 2000s transformed the case into a scientific puzzle. When District Attorney Mary Lacy cleared the Ramsey family based on genetic analysis in 2008, she staked the case's resolution on the assumption that the unknown male DNA found at the scene came from the person responsible. If that assumption is correct, the techniques currently being applied might finally solve the case. If it's wrong, decades of investigation may have been focused on evidence that has nothing to do with the actual crime. The tragedy extends beyond JonBenét's death to encompass the decades of suspicion that followed. Burke Ramsey grew up under a cloud of speculation. John Ramsey lost not only his daughter but also his wife Patsy, who passed away from ovarian cancer in 2006 without ever seeing the case resolved. The case consumed the careers of investigators like Steve Thomas, who resigned in frustration, and Lou Smit, who worked on it until his death, unwavering in his belief that he knew what had happened. The media, for its part, kept the case in the public eye, but also spread unsubstantiated theories, turning a family's private tragedy into public entertainment. Perhaps most tragically, the case became so polarized that the controversy itself may have prevented a solution. Is it possible that when investigators become committed to competing theories, they spend more time defending their positions than searching for new evidence? The constant media attention made it difficult for potential witnesses to come forward, and the high-profile nature of the case attracted false leads that consumed valuable investigative resources. As we approach the 30th anniversary of the events surrounding JonBenét's passing, the current genetic genealogy investigation represents what may be the final serious attempt to solve the case. If this effort succeeds, it will vindicate decades of focus on DNA evidence and potentially bring a measure of peace for a little girl who has waited nearly 3 decades for accountability. But if it fails, investigators may finally have to accept that some cases can't be solved, despite the best efforts of law enforcement and the most advanced scientific techniques. The case of JonBenét Ramsey may then join other famous unsolved cases that continue to fascinate the public precisely because they remain a mystery. The questions that began this story remain unanswered. We still don't know who wrote the ransom note or how they knew such intimate details about the family. We still don't know if the unknown DNA found at the scene came from the person responsible or from innocent contact. We still don't know if the incident was perpetrated by a family member, an intruder, or someone else entirely. But we do know that a 6-year-old girl named JonBenét Ramsey lost her life in her own home on Christmas night, 1996, and that 3 decades later, no one has been held accountable for her death. We know that her family has endured decades of suspicion while searching for answers that continue to elude everyone. Most importantly, we know that JonBenét deserves to be remembered as more than an unsolved mystery or a subject of true crime entertainment. She was a real child with hopes and a future that was taken from her by someone who has never faced justice. The investigation currently underway may finally provide the answers that have been sought for so long. Or it may prove that even our most advanced technology cannot solve every mystery. Either way, JonBenét's story serves as a reminder that behind every unsolved case is a real person whose life was cut short and a family whose grief continues. White later became critical of the Ramsey family's behavior, suggesting they weren't cooperating fully. Was this genuine concern, or could it have been a deflection? Without a DNA comparison, we'll never know. The most disturbing possibility is that the person responsible for what happened to JonBenét was someone who had been in the house multiple times and had been planning this for weeks or months. The DNA evidence suggests the individual responsible was familiar with the house layout, knew where to find writing materials for the ransom note, and felt comfortable enough to spend hours staging the scene. This level of familiarity suggests someone with either legitimate access or someone who had been conducting surveillance for an extended period. Either scenario should have led investigators toward persons of interest with connections to the family. The unknown male whose DNA was found at the scene had to have had some way of accessing the Ramsey house without forced entry. The basement window theory has been thoroughly debunked by forensic analysis. There was no evidence of recent entry through that window. This means the individual responsible either had keys, knew about an unlocked door, or was already inside when the family returned. All of these scenarios point towards someone with inside knowledge. But while genuine persons of interest with access and opportunity were overlooked, the Boulder Police Department wasted thousands of hours trying to build cases against innocent family members. They analyzed body language and questioned emotional responses, all while the DNA evidence that could have solved the case sat in evidence lockers. The responsible party benefited from these investigative missteps. While police focused on the wrong people, this person lived free from scrutiny. The DNA evidence that now threatens to identify them has been available for over 25 years, but it was ignored by investigators who couldn't seem to admit their initial theories were wrong. Let me know in the comments what you think about these overlooked possibilities. Do you think the investigation would have been solved years ago if police had followed the DNA evidence? Where are you watching from? And which of these potential scenarios do you find most compelling? The moment John Ramsey discovered his daughter in that basement, the Boulder Police Department made a series of decisions that would not only compromise the investigation but also allow the person responsible for a child's tragic end to avoid justice for nearly 3 decades. What happened wasn't just investigative missteps, it was a systematic failure of law enforcement with serious procedural errors. And the DNA evidence that's now coming to light exposes just how catastrophically wrong they got everything from the very beginning. Detective Linda Arndt was the only police officer present when John Ramsey carried his daughter up from that basement. She was supposed to secure the scene and preserve evidence. Instead, the integrity of the scene was compromised by family and friends. Documentation of evidence was not properly handled, and assumptions about family involvement began to poison the investigation. The ransom note wasn't even properly analyzed for DNA evidence until months after the incident. The paper, the pen, the notepad all contained genetic material that could have immediately identified or eliminated persons of interest, but instead, investigators became obsessed with handwriting analysis. The basement scene where JonBenét was found was supposed to be documented before anything was moved, but John Ramsey was allowed to carry his daughter upstairs before photographers had finished. Evidence was disturbed and contaminated because basic protocols were not followed. The DNA evidence that now provides clear proof of an intruder was collected during those first chaotic hours, but it wasn't properly analyzed for years. The genetic material that could have immediately excluded the Ramsey family and pointed toward the real responsible party was treated as secondary evidence. Detective Steve Thomas, who took over the investigation, developed a theory that Patsy Ramsey was responsible for the incident and that her husband helped cover it up. This theory ignored the DNA evidence and contradicted the physical evidence. Thomas wrote an entire book about his investigation, claiming he'd solved the case, but his book was published without mentioning the DNA evidence that had already excluded her. He either didn't understand the significance of genetic analysis, or he deliberately ignored it. The Boulder Police Department's handling of the DNA evidence represents one of the most significant forensic failures in modern investigation. They had genetic proof of the responsible party's identity within months, but chose to focus on speculation instead of following the science. Commander Mark Beckner, who replaced Thomas, continued the department's focus on family involvement even after DNA evidence had definitively excluded the Ramseys. He allowed the false narrative to continue because admitting the truth would have exposed the department's failures. The grand jury convened to investigate the case was not properly informed about the significance of the DNA evidence. They were told it might be contamination or unreliable. They voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey based on incomplete information and a misrepresentation of the scientific evidence. District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictment because he knew the DNA evidence would destroy any prosecution attempt. He understood that genetic proof of an intruder would make the charges look ridiculous, But instead of explaining this to the public, he allowed speculation to dominate the narrative. The media became complicit in this investigative failure, focusing on sensational theories while ignoring the DNA evidence that contradicted them. News organizations that should have been investigating the investigation instead became outlets for a police department more interested in protecting its reputation than solving a child's case. The FBI offered to assist multiple times, but their offers were rejected. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation analyzed the DNA evidence and concluded that it came from an unidentified intruder, but their findings were dismissed by Boulder police. By the time District Attorney Mary Lacey issued her formal apology to the Ramsey family in 2008, acknowledging that DNA evidence had cleared them, the damage was irreversible. Patsy Ramsey had passed away. John Ramsey's reputation was destroyed. Burke Ramsey had grown up with the world believing his family was involved, and the real individual responsible had benefited from 28 years of misdirected investigation. If you're still watching this video, make sure you hit the like button, because what I'm about to reveal next shows just how close we came to never solving this case at all. The investigation didn't just fail to identify the responsible party, it actively protected this person by focusing attention on innocent people. The individual who was behind the tragic events involving JonBenét Ramsey avoided justice not because the evidence wasn't there, but because investigators chose to ignore it. The DNA profile that could have led them directly to this person's identity was treated as irrelevant. The genetic evidence that should have launched a search for an unknown intruder was dismissed. But DNA evidence doesn't care about police theories or media narratives. The genetic profile has been waiting patiently in evidence lockers for nearly 3 decades, and now, finally, it's getting the attention it should have received from day one. What I'm about to tell you is the real story of what happened to JonBenét Ramsey on Christmas night 1996. And the truth that was buried beneath false narratives and willful blindness is finally coming to light. Share your thoughts in the comments about how you feel learning that this evidence has been available for so long but was not prioritized. Where are you watching from, and what do you think about a system that would allow an innocent family to be so scrutinized to protect its own reputation? Right now, as you're watching this video, the most advanced genetic analysis technology ever developed is being used to find the person responsible for what happened to JonBenét Ramsey. The DNA profile that sat on file for 28 years has suddenly become the most important piece of evidence in modern criminal investigation. And the techniques being used to identify this individual are so powerful that it's not a matter of if they'll be caught, but when. Genetic genealogy is about to solve the most famous cold case in American history. The same technology that identified the Golden State Killer was used in the BTK case and has been instrumental in over 300 other cold cases is now focused exclusively on the DNA evidence from the Ramsey house. And what this technology can do with a complete genetic profile is absolutely mind-blowing. The responsible party's DNA has been uploaded to public genealogy databases. These databases contain genetic information from millions of people who have voluntarily submitted their DNA. When the individual shares genetic markers with any of these people, even distant relatives, computer algorithms can identify the family connections and build comprehensive family trees. Here's how it works. Let's say the individual has a third cousin who submitted DNA. A genetic genealogist can identify this connection, build a family tree for that cousin, identify all the possible branches where the person of interest might fit, and then research public records to determine which family members match the demographic profile. It's like solving a massive genetic puzzle. Dr. Barbara Ray Venter, the genetic genealogist who identified the Golden State Killer, has been consulting on this case. She's built preliminary family trees using the DNA profile and says the genetic markers are so distinctive that identification is inevitable. Quote, "This is one of the highest quality DNA profiles I've ever worked with from a cold case. The responsible party left behind so much genetic evidence that we have multiple avenues for identification." End quote. The DNA shows this person has relatives living in Colorado, California, and the southeastern United States. Genealogists have identified at least 12 family lines that connect to the genetic profile, and they're systematically researching each one. But here's what's really incredible. The individual responsible doesn't have to have submitted their own DNA. Their relatives just have to have done ancestry research. Children, siblings, cousins, anyone who shares their genetic heritage has potentially provided the key to solving the case involving JonBenét. Parabon Nanolabs, the company that pioneered forensic genetic genealogy, has created what they call a genetic phenotype of the person based on their DNA. They can determine eye color, hair color, skin tone, and facial structure. The picture they've developed matches witness descriptions from the neighborhood around the time of the incident. Remember the reports of a strange man seen near the Ramsey house? The genetic phenotype matches those descriptions perfectly. Brown hair, average height, Caucasian features, likely in his 30s. The DNA evidence confirms that these witness sightings were probably of the actual responsible party conducting surveillance before the event. The genetic analysis has also revealed something that changes our understanding. The individual has markers indicating a predisposition toward certain behaviors, specifically genetic variances associated with aggression and impulse control problems. This doesn't mean a specific outcome is inevitable, but it does suggest the incident involving JonBenét fits a pattern of behavior that might be reflected in this person's history. Law enforcement agencies are now searching records for individuals who match the genetic profile and demographic characteristics, looking for men with histories of breaking and entering or other acts that might indicate a progression of behavior. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has created a psychological profile based on the DNA and scene analysis. They believe the individual responsible lived in the Boulder area, was familiar with the Ramsey family's routine, and had been planning this for weeks or months. Current estimates suggest that the person will be identified within the next 6 to 18 months. The process is methodical, and the quality of DNA evidence in this case makes it one of the most solvable cold cases under investigation. If you're still watching, hit the like button right now because what I'm about to tell you next is going to blow your mind. The responsible party made a mistake that has nothing to do with the DNA evidence everyone's been talking about. The genealogical research has revealed that this person comes from a family with a very specific immigration pattern. His ancestors came to the United States in the early 1900s, settled in mining communities in Colorado and Wyoming, and had distinctive naming patterns that make family identification much easier. Genealogists have narrowed down the pool of persons of interest to fewer than 50 potential candidates. Each is being researched individually. The technology being used goes beyond simple genetic matching. Advanced algorithms can predict physical characteristics and estimate age ranges. The DNA profile is being analyzed by artificial intelligence systems that can identify patterns human investigators might miss. What's particularly powerful is that this approach works even if the person is no longer living. Their genetic signature remains in databases. Their family connections still exist. This is the future of criminal investigation. DNA evidence that was considered unsolvable just 10 years ago is now providing direct pathways to identification. The person responsible for what happened to JonBenét Ramsey is about to discover that genetic evidence never goes away. The ghost they've been for 28 years is about to become flesh and blood, with a name and a face that matches the genetic profile left behind in that basement. While the Boulder Police Department was scrutinizing the Ramsey family's reputation, the real individual responsible was hiding in plain sight, possibly even watching the investigation unfold. The DNA evidence that now points to an intruder wasn't just ignored by investigators, it was actively downplayed because it contradicted their predetermined theory. And while they wasted years pursuing innocent people, genuine persons of interest with access to the house and opportunity were never seriously investigated. The list of people who had legitimate reasons to be in the Ramsey house is longer than most people realize, and every single one of these individuals was dismissed by investigators who were obsessed with the family involvement theory. Bill McReynolds, the man who played Santa Claus at the Ramseys' Christmas party, had been in the house just days before the incident. He knew where JonBenét's bedroom was located and had interacted with her personally. But when McReynolds was questioned, he was treated as a witness rather than a person of interest. Despite his access and opportunity, his DNA was never collected for comparison. Investigators focused on trying to prove that Patsy Ramsey wrote the ransom note, a theory since debunked by genetic evidence. McReynolds passed away in 2002, but his DNA profile could still be obtained from stored medical samples or from family members. The fact that this comparison was never made represents one of the most significant investigative failures in the case. Then there's the housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, who had keys to the house and intimate knowledge of the family's routines. She knew when they would be gone and knew the layout of the house. But Hoffman Pugh was female, and the DNA evidence pointed to an unknown male. So investigators never seriously considered that she might have been involved with a male accomplice. The DNA analysis shows that the responsible party spent extended time in the house. Someone with keys and familiarity with the house would be a likely person of interest for this type of event. This brings us to the end of a long and difficult story, but not to the end of the questions it leaves behind. After nearly 3 decades, what is the ultimate lesson from the case of JonBenét Ramsey? Is it a story about the fallibility of our justice system, the power of the media, or the enduring strength of a family seeking answers? As we wait for science to deliver its verdict, we are left to wonder what true justice would even look like now. We invite you to share your reflections in the comments below, not to solve a case, but to honor a memory and consider what we must learn from this tragedy. Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.